My name is Sydney Yeager, and I am the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm honored to introduce today's program, QAnon and Antisemitism, a Dangerous Nexus. Joining us today are Paul Salmons, Dr. Mia Bloom, and Dr. Sophia Moskalenko. The discussion will be moderated by John Avlon. Paul Salmons, who is joining us from the UK, is a Holocaust education specialist, curator of the groundbreaking exhibition Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, chief curator of Seeing Auschwitz, and a consultant to the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dr. Mia Bloom is a fellow with New America's International Security Program and professor of communication and Middle East studies at Georgia State University in Atlanta. Dr. Bloom is the author of several books, with the most recent being Pastels and Pedophiles, Inside the Mind of QAnon, which she co-authored with Dr. Sophia Moskalenko. And Dr. Sophia Moskalenko is a social psychologist studying mass identity, intergroup conflict, and the appeal of conspiracy theories. She's currently a research fellow at Georgia State University and the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism. And John Avlon, who will be serving as our moderator today, is an author, columnist, and commentator. He's a senior political analyst at CNN, and his new digital series, Reality Check, Extremist Beat, examines the history behind the rise of QAnon and other recent conspiracies in the United States. During the discussion, Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can during the hour. This program is being recorded and the video will be available tomorrow on the museum's YouTube channel. Thank you all for being here, and I'm now going to hand things over to John.
Thank you very much, Sydney, and it's great to be with you all for what I think is a really fascinating and important conversation. I have been covering the extremism in American politics since I wrote a book called Wingnuts over a decade ago, and it has metastasized much further than I ever imagined at that time. And for the release of this new digital series we're doing on CNN called Reality Check Extremist Beat, the first one was a look at the roots of QAnon, by which I meant sort of the older ancient conspiracy theories that it perhaps subliminally draws on, chief among which are anti-Semitism and even strains of anti-Catholicism that have been forgotten in the minds of many. And I couldn't ask for a better conversation or a better place. This museum is such a valuable center for civic conversation and for confronting these ancient viruses of hate. And you all are great scholars who've really looked into the contemporary trends and how they apply to history and what that can tell us. So Mia and Sophia, I want to begin with you by really drilling down into, for the blissfully uninitiated, what is QAnon, but then even more importantly, how it riffs off of these anti-Semitic tropes of the past. Mia, let's start with you.
QAnon is one of these baseless conspiracy theories that started in the underbelly of the internet on these message boards, the chans. And the chans had previously been known to be a place where you could find pornography and hate speech. And it's really sort of the worst of the internet. And so what happened is from these chans, it moved across the internet to more open, sort of well-known platforms, whether it was Reddit or Facebook or Instagram. And the basis of the conspiracy argues that there is a cabal of blood-drinking elites, mostly Democrats, but including some prominent Republicans, who have been manipulating and pulling the strings of the world since time began, and that they maintain their power by trafficking in children, sexually abusing children, and drinking their blood. And so the argument was that former President Trump was the only person who could break the power of the cabal and save the children. And so that's where we ended up. It starts in October 2017. Almost none of the predictions that they ever made came true. And so what we end up with is several million people in the United States now that believe in sort of the most insane argument that there is a blood drinking cabal of Democrats and Hollywood elites that are trafficking in children.
And I mean, Sophia, just to put a finer point on it, you don't need to be that well versed in the history of anti-Semitism to hear the words cabal, blood drinking, and child abduction, and to realize that whether these folks know it or not, that they have fallen for some of the most ancient viruses of anti-Semitism that continue to perpetuate. Tell us a little bit about how these libels, these these hate messages are trafficked and pushed on social media?
Yes, so you're absolutely right. There's this veiled speech that clearly talks about anti-Semitic tropes, whether it's the cabal, stealing of Gentile children, drinking their blood. It all rings very true for anybody who knows history of anti-Semitism. And of course, the name of George Soros that is used as a euphemism for Jews that control the world. And in that way, QAnon really tapped into long-standing hostilities that were already becoming kind of aggravated in the run-up to the presidential election of Donald Trump in 2016. So by the time QAnon rolled onto our social scene, it was well prepared for the narratives that it was spreading. And it really feeds on people's darkest fears, darkest anxieties, this idea that the world is not exactly as it seems, that it's almost like the Matrix, and QAnon used this Matrix movie language, red pilling, that really we're all just being used for, somebody's enrichment and entertainment and some horrible perversions. So QAnon is, in that way, the latest incarnation of movements that usually happen at a time of great political and economic uncertainty, when people are looking for somebody to blame, looking for explanations for why things are not what they expected them to be. And very often, unfortunately, Jews become that scapegoat.
That's one of the interesting things, or the puzzling things about this particular incarnation of this ancient virus. Donald Trump is a lot of things, but I don't think there's a ton of evidence he's anti-Semitic, right? His daughter is Jewish, among other things. Incredibly popular in the state of Israel, another. And when he came to power in that populist revolt, I understood why you'd have populist revolts in the wake of the Great Recession in 2010. Demagogues always do well in economic downturns. But the economy was expanding and had been expanding for some time when Donald Trump came to power. And so, Paul, it leads me to you. What are these deeper conditions, and Sophia touched on some of them, that creates an environment ripe for the mainstreaming of these conspiracy theories over time, and how do they relate to our times?
Thanks, John. Yes, as already been touched on, conspiracy theories tend to thrive at times of deep anxiety, public anxiety, whether that's in a time of political turmoil, of economic dislocation, of social upheaval. So they tend to thrive at times when the world feels more random and more chaotic and more unpredictable than we are comfortable with. Unfortunately, that is the world we live in, right? I mean, we're not usually very good at actually foreseeing events as they even appear on the horizon. I didn't see Brexit coming. I'm not very good at foretelling events. There are great dislocations and unsettling events. I also didn't see a much more positive event, in my view, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Things happen at unpredictable times, and things can change very quickly. So if we looked at, a case study, for example, which is certainly relevant to the Museum of Jewish Heritage and its work in Holocaust education and Holocaust history, the era just following the First World War, a time when Germany, of course, was in defeat, when it suffered enormous economic challenges with hyperinflation. Later in the 20s, the Great Depression and mass unemployment. In other parts further east in Europe, in Russia, there'd been a communist or Bolshevik revolution. There were fears of that happening within Germany as well. In these sorts of times when people are confronted with really challenging and difficult issues, simplistic explanations that somehow there is a kind of hidden hand behind all of this, that there is a secret group, a cabal, if you like, that is controlling events, can somehow be reassuring and psychologically comforting, I think, because it does at least restore the notion of human agency in the world. And I think there are Yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think this is one of the kind of key features of conspiracy theorists. It's rather a modern phenomena, by which I mean late 18th century onwards. QAnon has clearly roots which are much older than that in terms of the blood libel and anti-Semitic tropes. But the conspiracy theories really get a boost, I think, in a period, again, of dislocation, of unsettlement, which follows a kind of decline in the influence of the church. A time of increasing secularization. You're starting to live in a world which is more difficult to explain. If you previously relied upon the church and on religious teachings to explain the world, that has less sway. And in some sense, I think we see, for liberal economists, the world becomes explained by the hidden hand of the market. For religious people, it might be the hidden hand of God and God's divine intervention or his plan. For the conspiracy theorist, the hidden hand is the hand of the secret group that is somehow controlling and pulling the strings. So I think in a time of anxiety and of great disorientation, this is the time we see these things thrive.
So to your point, not all the economic dislocation, it's not about economic dislocation exclusively, although I do recall that one of the Trump campaign's closing arguments in 2016 was laden with sort of Soros-esque and what many people said was anti-Semitic imagery around anxieties about the unequal recovery from the Great Recession. But Mia, you've got a number of fascinating slides I want to give you a chance to show, but in them are statistics that I hadn't seen, and they were pretty mind-blowing and troubling. One was a survey in the Washington Post showing just how what in politics we sometimes call asymmetric polarization applies to conspiracy theories and the adoption of QAnon. That 29% of Republicans believed in the survey on American life published in the Washington Post that Trump had been secretly fighting a group of child sex traffickers that include prominent Democrats and Hollywood elites. That's QAnon. And then 58% believe that the deep state had been running against him, which is a variation on that theme. And then, lest anybody think that maybe this connection between QAnon and anti-Semitic imagery is accidental, another survey that you have shows that nearly 4 out of 5 Americans who believe in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, talk about greatest hits of anti-Semitism, also subscribe to QAnon. That's pretty stunning, and it does show that regardless of Trump's personal beliefs on the issue of anti-Semitism, that there does seem to be a unfortunate partisan political tinge to these conspiracy theories at this point in our politics. How do you explain that?
Well, I think it's important to recognize, first of all, Donald Trump has an elevated status for many people who believe in QAnon. The way in which QAnon has portrayed Donald Trump in almost divine-like manner. And we've seen some of these memes of, Jesus with Donald Trump, or that he's been ordained, or they sometimes have Jesus with a very young Donald Trump. But what was so fascinating from the American Enterprises Institute poll that was published in Washington Post was that 6% of people who believed in this, the worst of the tropes, that there's a blood drinking cabal, were self-defined as Democrats. And a lot of these people would have been Bernie supporters or people who were pulled in the summer of 2020 through Instagram and through QAnon's Save the Children campaign, because we started to see it appeal to the mommy bloggers and the yogis and the people who believed in homeopathic medicine, as well as vegans. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know a lot of vegan Republicans. So when we look at 6%, that to me is very surprising. When you break it down within the Republicans or people who identify as Republicans, disproportionate number of people who believe in QAnon are also evangelicals. And it resonates with evangelicals in a way because this awakening, the storm, is kind of how they, discovered Jesus, as well as this idea that there is an actual battle between good and evil. But we have to consider this. If the other side is Satan and evil, there is no compromise. There's no middle ground that you can negotiate in Congress or Senate. And so I think that that's very useful for Republicans to portray things in very stark and partisan fashion. But it is still surprising. We see QAnon in almost every language. Sophia charted it in 85 different countries in the book, but also we have QAnon channels in Hebrew. So we have Orthodox Jews who support Donald Trump, who are anti-vaccine, and so that they also believe in QAnon.
I mean, that slippery slope towards mass adaptation of QAnon is it's fascinating, and you're right. I mean, the poll that you were citing, in fact, which was the one in Washington Post, 6% of Democrats said they believed this, 29% of Republicans. But if you look at, for example, of some of the anti-vax conspiracies, a decade ago, those were more prevalent on what might be broadly called the left, and it does illustrate what I sometimes refer to as the horseshoe theory. Sometimes you look at things and it seems there's a right and a left, but they bend back to something like the same place. Indeed, in the reality check Extremist Beat we did on the roots of QAnon, interviewed pastors who'd seen members of their congregations be overtaken, and they felt, they said, I have an hour a week. They said these folks can be online 5-6 hours a night. And they point out that a lot of the structural messaging of QAnon seems to ape basic elements of Christian faith. What, of course, is so striking is that in recent decades, there have been great strides among the evangelical community to make them identify with Israel, not against it. So again, it raised this question, how has this become so mainstreamed? And Sophia, may I just refer to the fact that you've done so much work looking at how QAnon has spread so prevalently. And one of the big questions I've got is, given how rooted it is in domestic politics and complete paranoid nonsense, but in US politics, how do you account for its ability to go viral in different languages in different countries that presumably don't have the same sort of cultural and political touchstones as the United States heading into an election?
So I think you're making a very common mistake in paying too much attention to what they're saying.
It's not the first time I make comments.
in their narratives, which sometimes obscures the real reasons why they're in it.
Okay.
And those reasons have maybe less to do with the justifications and more to do with deep-seated emotions. A lot of political processes that have an ideology attached to it are at the root emotional movements. And I think it's the case with QAnon. And so if we look at the rate of public engagement with QAnon content, we had mentioned that we see the first Q drop in the late 2017, but really between when the first Q drop occurred and when we see really the contagion, it took a long time. So there's a very gradual, very little increase of engagement online with QAnon content until COVID pandemic and state mandated lockdowns. That's when we see a geometric progression in the number of people who engage with the content, like it and spread it by retweeting or reposting and so on. And in that sense, QAnon and the community online that believed in QAnon, they offered something that was desperately needed at a time around the world when we were dealing with this virus that we knew very little about. It was a new threat. It was a very dangerous thing and deadly thing. And so we were all experiencing a lot more anxiety than normal, a lot more uncertainty. We were feeling out of control and we were being isolated. So we were feeling lonely. Mm-hmm. And all of those four psychological conditions, anxiety, uncertainty, lack of control, and isolation or loneliness, we know from psychological research, all of those contribute to conspiratorial mindset. In average people, you and me would become more willing to entertain conspiracy theories if we were made to feel more anxious, more out of control, and more lonely and isolated. And this was happening on a massive scale everywhere. And of course, being that emotionally unwell and going online, because that was the only place where we could go, very quickly through these algorithms that we now know, they favor things that are very emotive. They favor things that are fear-inducing, that keep people online, right? Because if you're threatened by something, you want to know more, you want to dig in, you want to find out how to prevent that thing from happening. But through social media, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, very quickly people would end up at QAnon content. And there it was for many like an addiction, because figuring things out for themselves and solving this puzzle and connecting the dots is very much like a video game, in that it produces a dopamine hit in the user's brain. Every time you feel like you've discovered a clue to how the world works, you feel good about yourself. You feel smarter than an average person. You feel that you're privy to some important information, and that makes you want to go in for more. And that's how people end up spending hours and days online and lose connection in the real world, which pushes them even deeper.
So, Sophia, that is such an important point. And one of the widespread theories that gets to the root, quote unquote, of QAnon in terms of actually how this was orchestrated, so to speak, is that it had all the heraldry of what's known as a LARP, a live action role playing game. And that mechanism, actually the gamification of a conspiracy theory during a time of COVID, is what causes it to catch on. But thank you for clarifying for me that it was actually that process and the circumstances and the psychological environment that allowed it to take off. Paul, tell me a little bit more about your understanding of Sophia illustrated some of the elements, but what accounts for the psychological need for conspiracy theories, and the persistence of some of these? I mean, we can get into various tributaries later, but just more broadly, what to you accounts for that psychological need for some people have and not others to believe conspiracy theories?
Well, I think picking up on the psychology, one aspect there is that on a very deep level, we are storytelling animals, right? We make sense of the world through narrative, and we tell the stories about ourselves that we like to believe about ourselves. So we will narrate aspects of our past that will create a kind of sense of identity and community and belonging, that will emphasize certain aspects of our history and perhaps downplay others. We will find patterns in events in order to try to make sense of these things. And I think there's a lot of patternicity in conspiracy theories generally, and I think we see it in QAnon certainly, where unrelated events can be threaded together as if there is a compelling story or compelling narrative, which gives some kind of sense of order to the world, even when it's a story which we find deeply disturbing, very upsetting. But those emotional elements, of course, are part of what also make them compelling. So this storytelling aspect is an easier way. We're kind of predisposed to this, rather than a way of trying to understand the world in its deep complexity, how certain things actually happen at random. Some things are coincidental. Mostly, we're not really very good at being able to kind of control events. For a conspiracy theory to be true, they often have kind of quite global implications. So I'll take a step back, because there are actual conspiracies in the world as well, right? I mean, there are such things as conspiratorial plots. These things do and have existed. Sometimes people get together for their own advantage and to do harm to others. Watergate would be one example. Al-Qaeda's attack on the United States in September 2001 would be another conspiracy, and a group of actors that plot to cause harm to others or to gain advantage for themselves.
I mean, I think there's a difference between conspiracy theory and an actual conspiracy.
That's
So
right.
we make that distinction in the book.
Doing that. How would you draw that?
This is the distinction I wanted to make. The difference, a key difference between them, is that a genuine conspiracy will tend to be a rather defined action or set of events, such as Watergate, bugging the offices of the Democratic Party, and then a kind of bungled attempt to cover that up. Yeah, attack on the World Trade Center. it's the conspiracy theorists will have this kind of fantasy about a kind of global reach, as if a small group of people are controlling all sorts of events, financial institutions, governments, the media. It's such a vast idea of a conspiracy. If you stop and think about it, it's clearly impossible, partly because of the huge numbers of people that would need to be involved, how dedicated they'd all need to be, how none of them really make mistakes. We all know we mess up in our work, in our jobs, right, in our lives, but not this cabal or their cohorts. Everything is meticulously planned and pans out the way that they apparently intended. That isn't the way that the world is. But the storytelling aspect, that can kind of thread disparate events together as if they form this kind of common narrative, is one which I think is compelling, and we find it in fairy tales, in myths, in literature.
Certainly. I mean, but Mia, one of the striking things about all this is that we've dealt with anti-Semitism. Humanity has for centuries. It is striking to me that QAnon in such a short period of time was able to proliferate with its exaggerated cartoonish absurdity. You can't even explain it with a straight face.
Well, I mean, the people who believe in it, and I'm going to make the distinction between the people who profited off of it and some of these QAnon influencers, whether it's Sidney Powell or it's Lynn Wood or disgraced General Michael Flynn. I want to make the distinction between the people who benefited and the people who might have been pulled down the rabbit hole for actually really good and altruistic reasons. And I'll give you the comparison. I just finished a book on women in ISIS, and the way in which ISIS recruited young girls, well-intentioned, smart girls in the West, like those girls from Bethnal Green Academy that disappeared from London in 2015 was, did you want to save the orphans in Syria? And no one's going to say no. And so when it's phrased as, did you want to help the children? Very few people are going to say, I don't care about the children. So what QAnon was able to do was capitalize on people's innate, almost altruism and goodness. And I think that we need to understand that first and foremost, because this is a way that we can, reach a hand across the divide to help people out of QAnon if we're not starting from the position, oh, they're ridiculous and idiots, and they believe this conspiracy with it, which is internally inconsistent. And I will say one thing, I taught a course on conspiracy theory while I was writing the book, and Benjamin Franklin had this fantastic quote where he said, you can have a conspiracy among 3 people if 2 of them are dead. In other words, I think Joe Lusinski mapped at what point, how many people, and then there's diminishing returns of how long you can keep something a secret, which means that the reason we found out about Tuskegee, the reason we found out about Watergate, was that if there is an actual conspiracy, people are leakers. But if it's a conspiracy theory, then it's this assumption that they're able to contain this information and delude everyone and keep it secret. And it's involving thousands and millions of people, which again, really just defies any logic.
Sure. Sophia, what in your experience, I mean, there's an old quote from Jonathan Swift, which is, you cannot reason someone out of something they were not reasoned into. But how do you, in your experience, what do you think are the most effective ways to reason people out, or cause them to confront reality when it comes to something like QAnon that's incubated online?
So I like to say, when people ask me, what can we do to get people out of QAnon? I like to say the first thing I would like you to know is what not to do. And what not to do is, please don't argue or logic or rationale, the person out of their beliefs. Because you may succeed in that one conversation. Maybe, you will have facts and you will actually win over that one argument. But we know from research that what will happen after that same day and the days later and weeks later is the person will keep coming back and they will come up with reasons why they should have won the argument, and you just happen to prevail that one time because of whatever reason, and they will end up actually believing more than they did before they had the argument with you. So it's counterproductive to try to have logical arguments about people's beliefs in something like QAnon. What are some helpful things that can be done? So we know also from research that one of the biggest reasons people stay in QAnon or even come to QAnon is the community that it offers.
Yes.
And so when you try to argue with QAnon believers, you alienate them. You put them, you know, in the opposite camp and yourself as this like high and mighty and smarter than thou. And that makes them feel even more isolated than they did when they joined QAnon in the first place. And so what I'd like to say is, if you feel that it's possible to be, you know, socially connected with people in your life who are QAnon believers, without engaging with them on this logical cognitive level, and just engaging with them on the social emotional level, then you're opening the door to a possibility at some later date when they will waver and doubt and have questions, for them to come to you, and then you will be able to make strides, you know, in the direction that you're interested in. And just saying to somebody like that, I understand how you feel. That phrase, we know from research that it makes people less defensive and less polarized in their opinions and more open to worldviews that are maybe counter to their own worldviews.
Say that phrase again.
I understand how you feel. Just that.
Obviously, there are other, in this slide indicated that there are other concrete things that could be done, algorithm adjustments. I'm interested in psychological inoculation. I wonder what that entails from a teaching standpoint. Either Mia or Sophia, you can answer that.
This is a really interesting research. It's not very new, but it's just recently been applied to political polarization. But we've used it with harmful behaviors like drinking and smoking and problematic eating with great success. And what it is you tell a person in advance, before you think they might be exposed to harmful content, that, you know, you might see messages that are directed to people like you. So you tell them, you know, somebody's targeting you for whatever reason, which are have to be true. So, you know, messages that are targeting teenagers with advertisements for cigarettes, you know, we would say you might see messages that target teenagers because people want to make money off of your health. And so you put them on alert and you actually make them suspicious of this material rather than catching them unaware and then falling prey to it. And so with messaging and disinformation, there is a possibility to preempt the harmful effects of it if we communicate effectively with certain populations, as Mia said, for example, the Instagram moms who were already suspicious of vaccinations, who were already suspicious of the pharmaceutical industry and the medical industry as a whole. They were targeted by this QAnon content on those specific vulnerabilities. If we know about those vulnerabilities, then it would be useful to help these people build resilience against these kinds of messages. I think we lost John.
We might have lost John. Sydney, do you want me to take a question from the chat? I see that.
Yeah, actually, if you could talk about, actually, if we could go back to the why, like the slide where you had a QAnon interaction and the COVID outbreak. Could you talk about like what's on the y-axis and just like a little bit more about sort of that relationship?
You're talking about the fact that there was an uptick during, okay, so absolutely.
Yeah.
Let me show that slide again. That wasn't originally one of the slides that I sent you, but since Sophia was talking about it, one of the things that we saw beginning in October 2017, as Sophia mentioned, was a relatively flat slope in terms of the number of people who were interested in QAnon, engaging in QAnon, posting about QAnon. And there was a somewhat of an uptick. And I think if it hadn't been for the global pandemic, absolutely we would have seen it sort of almost not quite die out, but not become a central vector of American politics. And so what happens with the lockdowns, some of the things that Sophia already said is that people were forced online, whether it was for work or for school or for having nothing else to do. And once they were online and started asking questions, they were never more than 2 or 3 clicks away from QAnon content. And they slowly get pulled into this because what was going on for many of us, and again, I was in the same boat as all of you. There was a virus, it was novel, we'd never heard of it. We didn't know exactly how we got it. We didn't know who was more or less susceptible. For example, did the mask protect me or did it protect you from me? And so a lot of people had questions. And when you went online to ask questions, that's where you basically were getting a lot of misinformation. And because people were online and they were very discombobulated and they were very anxious, they became more susceptible to a conspiracy theory that offered an explanation to the world. And that, the example that I give is if you're crossing the street and you get hit by a bus, it's so random. These things don't happen. But if you think the bus driver was aiming for you, that makes a bit more sense. And so that's where people thought that if there's an evil plan, at least there's a logic to it. And it's not so haphazard over which I have very little control. And I see that John is back. So
yes, I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. It appears that I'm on my phone now that anyway, our home Wi-Fi seems to have crashed. So as long as you can all hear me, I'm back. My apologies. Paul, I wanted to go to you because I had Sophia was speaking eloquently, as Mia has, about the need for compassion and connection and not directly trying to use logic or confrontation to get people out of this. But as it relates, to the core mission of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and indeed the way I got interested in covering extremism and conspiracy theories was having lived through 9/11, working for the mayor of New York at the time, and then seeing 9/11 truthers emerge. Sometimes they're indisputable events. They're not conspiracies. This isn't behind the shadows. How do you account for the persistence of Holocaust denial, and do you consider it a conspiracy theory?
Yes, thanks, John. Well, first of all, the Holocaust itself is without doubt the most extensively documented, most intensively studied and best understood example of genocide or mass atrocity in human history.
Yes.
So we know the fundamental details. So there is broad consensus amongst scholars, despite the fact that there will be debates on aspects like when was the decision taken or why didn't the Allies do more to try and rescue the Jews of Europe. There are good historical arguments going on, but the basic outline and the detail of it, we know beyond doubt. And yet you still have people who deny the Holocaust happened, as you say. In some ways, I don't think we should be surprised by that. The Holocaust has erupted into our public consciousness, into our collective memory, in a way that was new and unprecedented. And it happened because very unusually, the actors that committed the genocide were themselves defeated. That's unusual in human history, right? They tend to have a monopoly on power and on violence, and they will be the ones that are left standing, and they will write these elements out of their history or present them in certain ways which are acceptable to them. But when the Nazis and their allies were defeated in the Second World War, and the evidence of the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes were there, and could be so well documented, and there were war crimes trials, this becomes beyond dispute. But psychologically, they're very, very difficult things to contain. So we know, for instance, from the work of Greg Stanton, in terms of the stages of genocide, he's identified the final stage of genocide is always denial. Every genocide has its deniers. So there's a kind of deep psychological need to avoid that. Now, is it a conspiracy? Yeah, a conspiracy theory, yes, in the sense that the denier's core argument, when you look into it, will come down to the idea of this is a hoax perpetrated by Jews for their own benefit. They sometimes call it the holo hoax, right? The idea will be that Jews will have invented this atrocity in order to extort reparations, other monies out of Germany and other European countries, and or to support their claims for a national homeland. So in order to believe Holocaust denial, you have to invest into, first of all, the idea that there is a conspiracy, again, a Jewish cabal, if you like, which is using this to manipulate the world. And in order to believe in those things, again, you have to have anti-Semitic tropes that are deeply embedded in them. You have to, at some level, believe the idea, the age-old myths that Jews are devious, that they're manipulative, that they're lying, and that they will do so, again, for their own benefit. So it is a conspiracy theory, and it is always anti-Semitic.
Does that mean, I was so struck by what you said, that all genocides end in denial. And I suppose I can imagine the psychological need for people to deny things of that degree of human horror. But given that it is the most documented mass genocide in human history, what does it say about our efforts to confront and ultimately defeat conspiracy theories and the virus of anti-Semitism if it's almost being presented by you as inevitable?
And it wasn't denied in all of Germany. So for example, there were significant differences between West Germany and East Germany in terms of the extent to which they dealt with their past. And so again, I've had these conversations like in Pakistan, where someone is saying to me that the Holocaust didn't happen. And I was like, okay, except for the fact that, you know, the Germans aren't denying it happened. So I think that that's an instance.
What do they say when you say that?
I tried to use logic. You know, I was doing a lot of field research in Pakistan for many years when I was researching one of my books on children involved in these terrorist groups, and they'd been kidnapped by the Pakistani Taliban, and they were teaching the kids to behead prisoners. And so part of it is, you know, what Sophia was saying, taking someone on head on, or calling them an idiot, or saying you're an anti-Semite, you're going to go nowhere. So I would sort of try to use a different kind of logic and say, well, you know, the Germans don't deny it happened, and they've paid out reparations. And so when the parties to the conflict aren't denying it, so it's not like Ataturk denying the Armenian genocide, or it's not like Assad denying what he did in Ghouta. So I think that it's important that it might be that Germany stands out as an exception to this idea of denial. The people who deny the Holocaust are generally not the people who were party or involved in it at the time. Or years later.
Yeah, I just want to press that one point. When you pointed out to that Pakistani, I'll assume, gentleman, that the Germans don't deny the Holocaust, what did he say?
The response is, well, you know, Israel controls everything. And so there's always another explanation. So for example, I had before an image that I posted where, according to QAnon, they see all the leaders of the world as being sort of in bed with this Jewish global conspiracy. And while QAnon doesn't deny the Holocaust, it minimizes the Holocaust. And so they'll have people like David Cole come on in the videos to say, well, you know, we're not saying it didn't happen, and lots of people died during World War II, but it's not, you know, these, the Zyklon B, these things were created after the Russians had conquered this part of Germany. So it's not that it's a complete denial, but it's a minimization, at least for QAnon, which is a little bit different than some of these institutes that are basically just about denying the Holocaust ever happened.
So, and Mia, you can take this, or Sophia, but building on the original question to Paul, and maybe it's about how you confront and overcome anti-Semitism or Holocaust denial, to locate it specifically, as opposed to something like QAnon. But what are the most effective means for addressing that hideous conspiracy theory and form of hate?
There's a difference, isn't there, between trying to talk someone out of a deeply held belief system, which may well be ideological and to which their identity is firmly connected, and trying to, so are your efforts primarily directed towards the believers? Are your efforts creating within a public space and a public realm widespread opportunities for those that do know about the truth of the past to commemorate and to memorialize it? There's an argument of ideas there and a contestation for space. and also the strategy of people, how do you prevent new people being drawn to that kind of conspiracy thinking or to those sorts of notions of Holocaust denial? Holocaust minimization, Holocaust trivialization, Holocaust diminishing, these are separate to Holocaust denial. There's also Holocaust celebration. They can be connected, they can overlap. But to me, a major element that we've neglected, I think, historically in our educational systems is what Michael Young, sociologist of education in the UK, has termed powerful knowledge. Powerful knowledge in his articulation is not simply the knowledge of the academy, which is presented and handed on and then tested. That would be the knowledge of the powerful to some extent. The idea that a government would set, or a state would set a curriculum, that a museum or a professor would decide on what's being taught. These are people in rather privileged positions who then narrate aspects of the world. What Michael Young calls for is, how do you share the deep disciplinary understandings by which they arrive at that knowledge? So how do we construct our view of the past? How is it when you study science, for example, perhaps you shouldn't just be teaching the scientific theories about the world, but scientific understanding based on the scientific method, so that a way of understanding how we arrive at knowledge of vaccines or of climate change are more transparent and more understood. So in terms of history, we need to do more work, I think, to explain how we know what we know about the past, how we interrogate sources, what our use of evidence is, and what our standards are. Because there isn't enough of a culture, I think, sometimes those that are drawn into conspiracy theories, they like to do the research. They enjoy, there's a frisson of going on and finding out. But if you don't understand how to weigh truth claims against the evidence, and the need to be able to change your view if strong contradictory evidence comes out, if you haven't got that kind of disposition, you will be at risk of being drawn into this kind of thinking.
Yeah, I think it is such an important point, because one of the catchphrases from QAnon is do the research, do your own research, and it is meaningless. It basically just means keep digging the hole you're in. And Sophia, one of the things that you had on your slide, and I want to get to some questions, and time is galloping by, but it is the idea of improving digital literacy. And maybe that can inoculate some people from some of these rabbit holes. Would you like to expand on that briefly?
Yeah, I think it also touches on what Paul was just saying. I think QAnon is really testing the limits of this idea of free speech this country is built on. So in Germany, for example, since we've talked about Germany, you cannot, throw out a Nazi salute. You cannot wear a swastika. You cannot sing the Nazi songs, because all of those are forbidden by laws. And here the limits are, there are limits to free speech, but I think with the advent of the social media and the internet and just the proliferation of disinformation of every kind, we really are coming to a point where we have to have a serious thought about, how do we deal with this exposure that we're experiencing? We are one thing, but for example, our children are a whole other thing. And a lot of people are not very savvy where it comes to discerning which sources of information are trustworthy and which are blatantly just bad sources that are out to get them, either for their money or for their votes or for their anger that they can then harvest into political action. I don't have an answer to that. I came to this country for its free speech and all the other opportunities that it has, and I love it for it. But I think time is, as you're saying, galloping by, and we're going to have to face these ideas and figure out how best to approach them. And maybe educating the new generation on media literacy is one way, and mandating that the social media giants that have become public squares, essentially, that they be more transparent about their methodology, and maybe that they be in some way responsible to us as the public. So that's a longer conversation we can have another day.
It's an important conversation to have. Mia, would you like to add anything to that?
I think that we're seeing it in real time where the testimony before the Senate, as far as what Facebook knew that its algorithms were doing. I'll give you an example. Reddit banned QAnon in 2018 for basically violating the terms of service and endangering the population and its users. In other words, it had this transcendence between online to offline harms. It took Facebook 2 years. And in fact, even a year after Christopher Wray had said that QAnon had the potential for terrorism, they still didn't deplatform QAnon. What's interesting is that when it was deplatformed, first in July of 2020, and then again October 2020, right before the election, what they started doing is exactly what ISIS did when they were deplatformed. They started using 17 Anon or CUE Anon, or they were, hiding their posts in some way. Or what we see now is they migrated to Telegram. And Telegram, which is run by Pavel Durov in Russia, does not care that Silicon Valley has deplatformed or thinks that this is dangerous. So we're still seeing it. And we're seeing it grow, and we're seeing it become an international movement that not only endangers the US democracy, as I've heard you say almost every morning when you're talking about our democracy is in peril, you are 100% right, John.
Well, it does. I didn't think we'd be fighting for our democracy right now, but there are tools, even though we're dealing with new circumstances, that we need to avail ourselves of. And, these things can be within our power. What's striking to me, and let me stay with you on this, QAnon officially disbanded after January 6th. All right, there have been some documentaries about the people or families that may have been behind this, various grifters, conspiracy entrepreneurs. But the Q drops stop and basically say, let's just be thankful for all the friends we made along the way. And yet the underlying ideology persists. And do you think it really is just a matter of education, algorithm changes, and being tough? Because I'm stunned that something can basically be revealed to be a fraud and yet still persist in the minds of so many.
I mean, they still believe it. And despite the fact that all of the premonitions and the predictions have not come true, Hillary Clinton wasn't arrested, Michelle Obama is not a man, Trump wasn't reelected, they start to fabricate all these explanations for what's actually going on, that it's not really Joe Biden, it's Trump wearing a Joe Biden mask and some very serious spanks because he's lost about 150 pounds. But the other thing is that we're starting to see what we would call intersectionality, that the Oath Keepers and the far right and the militias are trying to appeal and attract the QAnon believers, so that the QAnon people who start to have doubts or start to be very disappointed that none of these predictions are coming true might be fodder for the far right and groups that are actually dangerous, like militias and neo-Nazis and Patriot Front and so on and so forth.
We have one question that came in for you, Mia, about the connection between conspiracy theories and ISIS. And, terrorist recruitment is its own thing, but online radicalization, what flow through is there? What lessons are there?
I mean, the thing that really amazed me, so part of the project that we've continued the book, Sophia and I are working with Nellie Lahoud, who is the leading expert on jihadism, and she had the lead article in Foreign Affairs for the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Is that we're actually seeing less QAnon in the Middle East than we're seeing in almost any other part of the world, which is very strange because there is this natural predilection. We call it in Arabic, mu'amarat, like they love conspiracy theories, and yet they're not loving QAnon. There's a few places in the Middle East that we're seeing QAnon. And I don't know if it's inoculated partly because, this idea of false prophets or the idea of believing in something, or the fact that in Arabic, we really don't talk about pedophilia. But we do see some of the same ways and mechanisms of recruiting, of trying to lure people in by appealing to their softer side, their altruistic side. And this is why we called it Pastels and Pedophiles, because so much of QAnon are the women, and so much of ISIS relied on women. So that was where the connection was.
In the few minutes we have left, I want to give you each a chance to sum up. Sophia?
QAnon is a huge social movement. In the US alone, over 30 million people believe this conspiracy theory. It doesn't seem to be going away just because Q drops stop or because Donald Trump didn't come back to the White House. And so we should consider how we can help all these people to find their way back to their families, back to the society. One thing that's important, we haven't talked about it, but it seems like there is a much higher than average prevalence of mental health problems among QAnon followers. So mental health outreach is important. Social networking is important. Education as far as social media and internet literacy is important. And all of these need to be on a broad social scale because of how big and how complex QAnon is.
Paul?
I guess we shouldn't be surprised anymore that people have a very high capacity to believe things that evidently aren't true. I mean, we have climate denial, we have people who believe in creationism. There's all sorts of things that are clearly and evidentially falsifiable, and yet people will still go along with them and still believe in them, often for deeply held emotional reasons. We're not just rational beings, we're emotional beings as well, and deeply irrational. That said, conspiracy theories, QAnon and others, are obviously deeply harmful to our societies. I would say that they're harmful in at least three major ways. Firstly, they're harmful to the people, the individuals and the groups that they target. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theories are obviously harmful to Jews, and they will sometimes lead to real-world violence. And they will, even without that violence, they cause other forms of violence through discrimination and through other forms of ostracism, etc. They're also harmful to the people that hold those views, to the conspiracy theorists themselves, because they prevent them from living authentically in the world. You can't understand the world you're living in if you're buying into these kinds of beliefs. And third and finally, they are deeply harmful to the rest of us in society because they erode our foundations of truth, and they prevent us from actually, and if we can't agree on the things that are true in the world, it's extremely difficult for us to address our shared concerns and problems.
That's a very profound way to sum up. Mia, would you like to add anything else before I kick it to Sydney?
It's just that we really wanted to do something different with the book by offering people not just an explanation of QAnon, but also how to help friends and family out of it. And, you know, we used to joke that everybody's going to know someone either among their friends or their family. And then I found out my cousin was a believer in QAnon. So it's literally probably touching everyone. If these polls are representative, there could be 30 million Americans that believe in this, which is why the Institute for the Study of Religion placed QAnon as more popular than some religions, which means that we want to help people, but we also want to understand that if you want to help the children, there are far better ways to do it.
It is a crisis of faith in society and democracy and our ability to reason together. But I want to thank you all because this conversation was not only fascinating and I hope illuminating and clarifying for some people, but because I think it really highlights one of the reasons why I am such a believer and a supporter in the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Because I really think this incident illustrates why anti-Semitism is something that needs to concern all of us. That its various incarnations can be subtle and pervasive, but they keep emerging, and we need to learn how to identify them and confront them collectively as members of a civil society, which we are, and we will remain. Thank you so much. Sydney, to you.
Yeah, I would like to echo what John just said. Thank you all so much. And thank you to John as well. This was such a great conversation and I personally learned so much. And thank you all for joining us today. Everything we do at the museum is made possible through donor support. To those of you watching, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum or becoming a member and joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can check out at the link in the Zoom chat. Have a great afternoon and thank you so much again for joining us.